Close your eyes for a moment and picture this: the sharp crackle of a hungry flame, the faint, almost sweet scent of old paper curling into smoke, and the slow, deliberate dance of ash rising into the air. This isn't just any fire, it's a deliberate act of erasure. In these moments, some of history's most intimate, explosive, and world-altering secrets were intentionally turned to dust. We often think of history as a collection of solid facts, of documents carefully preserved in archives. But what about the letters that were never meant to be found? The ones that held confessions powerful enough to topple thrones, love affairs scandalous enough to rewrite royal lineages, and financial deals so corrupt they could ruin the most celebrated names of the Gilded Age. These burned letters represent a ghost archive, a collection of missing truths whose absence has, paradoxically, shaped our world as profoundly as any treaty or law. This journey into the ashes takes us into the heart of royal scandals and the drawing rooms of America's new aristocracy, where vast fortunes bought social standing but couldn't always purchase discretion. We'll uncover stories of Gilded Age heiresses, women whose immense wealth made them pawns and players in a transatlantic game of power and prestige. Their private correspondences, filled with raw ambition and desperate pleas, often contain truths too dangerous for the light of day. And on the other side of the ocean, in the gilded cages of Europe's royal courts, similar fires burned. Kings, queens, and their confidants systematically destroyed evidence of illicit affairs, hidden children, and political betrayals, all in an effort to control the narrative and protect a fragile power structure. The decision to burn a single piece of paper could alter the line of succession, shift military alliances on the eve of war, or seal the fate of a dazzling heiress who dared to love the wrong man. What we are about to explore is more than just a series of historical footnotes. It is a detective story pieced together from fragments, from the hints left behind in diaries, from the angry replies to letters we can no longer read, and from the glaring gaps in the official record. We are going to reconstruct these lost conversations, understanding that the silence left by the fire speaks volumes. This is a tale of what happens when the personal becomes perilously political, when a secret is so potent that its only safe destination is the flames. So settle in as we sift through the embers of the past to uncover the burned letters that changed history, discovering the breathtaking human drama that smoke and fire tried and failed to keep hidden from us forever. This instinct to destroy the written word is as old as writing itself. Think of the legendary Library of Alexandria, its vast collection of scrolls containing the knowledge of the ancient world, all lost to flames. That was a catastrophe on a grand scale, an erasure of collective human memory. But the burning of personal letters is a different kind of violence. It's a targeted, intimate assassination of a single truth. Throughout history, paper has been both a vessel for profound connection and an instrument of incredible danger. In an era before digital footprints, a handwritten letter was the primary conduit for the most sensitive of human exchanges. A king's secret instruction to his ambassador, a confession of forbidden love, or the raw, unfiltered business deal that built or broke a fortune. These were not sterile emails. They were physical extensions of the person who wrote them, often bearing their unique handwriting, the scent of their perfume, even the imprint of a tear. This very intimacy made them so perilous, because if they fell into the wrong hands, they were undeniable proof. So why choose fire? It offers a finality that tearing or discarding a letter could never provide. A ripped document can be pieced back together. A discarded one can be retrieved from a trash heap or stolen by a servant. But fire is absolute. It transforms the evidence into something intangible and irrecoverable, smoke and ash. It is the ultimate act of control, a desperate attempt to command the narrative by removing a piece of it entirely. For a royal court, burning a bundle of letters could mean erasing a queen's affair with a political enemy, thereby preventing a war or securing a dynasty. For a Gilded Age heiress, tossing a single incriminating note into the fireplace could mean protecting her reputation, her marriage prospects, or the immense social capital her family had spent a fortune to acquire. The decision to burn was almost always a calculation, a cold assessment that the risk of the letter's contents surviving was far greater than the value of the memory it held. It was an admission that some truths were simply too volatile to exist. This created what historians call a negative space in the historical record, a void that we know exists only because of the faint echoes it left behind. We see the scorch marks on a hearth and know a drama played out there. We read a diary entry that cryptically mentions disposing of that troublesome correspondence, and we understand a secret was buried in the flames. This prelude of lost histories, this bonfire of the vanities where pride, power, and fear were the kindling, sets the scene for the very personal, human stories of destruction we are about to uncover. Nowhere is this deliberate erasure more poignant or historically significant than in the private lives of Tsar Nicholas II and his wife, Tsarina Alexandra. The last rulers of Imperial Russia were prodigious letter writers, especially to one another. During the long separations forced by the First World War, when Nicholas was at military headquarters, they exchanged almost daily letters, pouring out their hearts, their fears, their devotion, and their political thoughts onto paper. These weren't just love notes. They were a continuous, running commentary on the collapsing empire they were desperately trying to hold together. We know for a fact that a vast number of these intensely personal documents were deliberately burned, creating one of the most tantalizing voids in modern history. The decision to destroy them was likely born from a desire for privacy and a fear of their words being twisted by enemies. But in doing so, they unknowingly burned away crucial evidence that could have helped us understand their tragic fate. Imagine the insights those lost pages held. While we have many letters that survived, the ones that were fed into the fireplace almost certainly contained the most sensitive material. This is where Alexandra, a deeply religious and mystically inclined woman, would have written with complete candor about her reliance on the controversial holy man, Grigory Rasputin. His influence over the royal family, and through them over state appointments and policy, was a primary cause of the public's fury and the aristocracy's disgust. The surviving letters hint at this, but the destroyed ones likely detailed the full extent of her belief in his prophecies and his alleged power to heal their hemophiliac son, Alexei. We lost the raw, unfiltered conversations where she might have relayed Rasputin's political advice directly to the Tsar, advice that often led to disastrous ministerial appointments that further destabilized the government. The fire consumed the very proof of how a peasant mystic's whisper in the Tsarina's ear could directly alter the course of a nation. Beyond the specter of Rasputin, the flames also took a more intimate, human story. These burned letters would have revealed the sheer weight of the couple's isolation and their private despair as the world crumbled around them. We catch glimpses of this in diaries, but the letters were their primary safe space. This is where Nicholas, a man often described as weak and indecisive in public, might have confessed his deepest doubts about his own ability to rule. This is where Alexandra, plagued by illness and anxiety, would have expressed her paranoia about the conspiracies she believed were swirling around them. The destruction of these documents means we are left with the official facade and the accounts of their enemies. We lost the authentic, vulnerable human voices at the very center of the storm. Their private struggles with their son's life-threatening condition, a state secret in itself, would have been detailed with a rawness that no official record could ever capture. Ultimately, this act of destruction, meant to protect their dignity, has left their historical legacy permanently shrouded in mystery and subject to the worst interpretations. The gap in the record forces historians to rely on secondhand accounts and the often hostile memoirs of those who betrayed them. The burned correspondence between Nicholas and Alexandra represents a catastrophic loss for understanding the human factors behind the Russian Revolution. We can piece together the political and economic causes, but to comprehend the profound personal missteps, the closed circle of their family life, and the specific moments where different decisions might have altered history, we needed those voices. Their absence leaves us with a haunting question. If we could read the words they deemed too dangerous to keep, would we see a doomed, out-of-touch couple, or would we find a tragically devoted family, blind to the inferno that was about to consume them all? The ash of their letters is a silent testament to a truth we can now only guess at. While the flames in Russia consumed a dynasty's political secrets, a very different kind of fire burned in the gilded salons and private studies of the Habsburg court, one fueled by personal anguish and a desperate desire for autonomy. If the story of Nicholas and Alexandra is a tragedy of state, then the story of Empress Elisabeth of Austria, known to history as Sisi, is a deeply personal one of a soul in a gilded cage. She remains one of the most enigmatic figures of the 19th century, a woman whose legendary beauty was matched only by the profound misery she concealed behind it. And a significant part of that mystique, that elusive quality that makes her so compelling to us today, stems directly from the letters she took great pains to destroy. Sisi was a prolific writer, penning thousands of pages of poetry, diaries, and correspondence. Yet she systematically curated her own legacy by feeding vast portions of it into the fireplace. She wasn't hiding state secrets in the traditional sense. She was hiding herself, her crushing unhappiness, her disdain for court life, and the whispers of emotional attachments that flourished outside her stifling marriage to Emperor Franz Joseph. To understand the weight of those burned pages, you have to understand the cage. Married at 16 to the young emperor, Sisi was thrust from a relatively carefree Bavarian childhood into the rigid, ceremonial stranglehold of the Viennese court. The Habsburg court was a place of immense formality, where every gesture, every word, and even the expression on one's face was governed by ancient protocol. For a free-spirited, intellectually curious, and intensely private young woman, it was a form of psychological torture. Her extensive travels, which became a defining feature of her later life, were not merely the indulgent tours of a wealthy empress. They were acts of escape. She spent months, sometimes years, away from Vienna, sailing the Mediterranean, riding on the shores of Corfu, or visiting distant lands. And during these long absences, she wrote. She wrote to her lady-in-waiting and confidante, Ida Ferenczi, and to a small, trusted circle of friends. It is in these lost letters that the real Sisi would have been laid bare. We know she burned the majority of them. What did they contain? They almost certainly held her raw, unfiltered critiques of the court she despised, her detailed accounts of the freedom she found in movement, and her deep philosophical musings on life and death, which bordered on the obsessively morbid. This intentional destruction was also a shield for the Habsburg dynasty itself. The empire was a fragile patchwork of ethnicities held together by the symbolic unity of the crown. The image of the imperial family was a crucial tool of statecraft. A publicly unhappy empress was bad enough, but rumors of romantic liaisons were a direct threat to the dynasty's stability. Sisi cultivated close, intense friendships with several men, most notably the Hungarian statesman Count Gyula Andrássy and her riding master, Captain William George Bay Middleton. While the exact nature of these relationships remains the subject of fervent historical debate, their emotional intensity was undeniable. The burned letters are the very center of this mystery. Did they contain confessions of platonic adoration or evidence of physical affairs? We will never know for certain because Sisi ensured we wouldn't. By destroying this correspondence, she protected not only her own privacy, but also prevented any definitive scandal from tarnishing the crown. She understood that even the perception of infidelity could be weaponized by political enemies in Hungary or elsewhere within the empire, potentially destabilizing her husband's already beleaguered reign. The consequence of this great bonfire of her soul is the legendary, almost mythic image of Sisi that persists today. We are left with the official portraits, the woman with the impossibly long chestnut hair, the flawless complexion, and the wistful, faraway look in her eyes. We have the public persona, the beauty icon, the fitness fanatic, the melancholic wanderer, but the authentic, complex, and tormented human being is largely a ghost, reconstructed from the few writings that escaped the flames and the observations, often unsympathetic, of those at court. The burned letters created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed legend and speculation. She became a canvas onto which every generation projects its own ideas about beauty, mental health, and female rebellion. We lost her own voice explaining her actions, her own words defending her choices, and her own hand describing the depth of her loves and her sorrows. In trying to control her narrative through destruction, she ultimately relinquished it to the world, ensuring that the true story of Empress Elisabeth of Austria would forever be a beautiful, haunting puzzle with the most crucial pieces missing. From the tragic, introspective fires of the Romanovs and Empress Sisi, we turn now to a blaze of a much more sinister and calculating nature. one that flickered in the luxurious exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. The story of King Edward VIII's abdication in 1936 is often told as the ultimate romantic sacrifice, a king who gave up his throne for the woman he loved. But what if that fairy tale narrative was merely a brilliant, convenient smokescreen, obscuring a far darker truth? Emerging from the shadows of this beloved story is a compelling theory that the Duke and his American wife, Wallis Simpson, systematically destroyed a cache of their most incriminating telegrams and letters. These weren't documents of personal heartache. They were communications detailing their direct links with high-ranking Nazi officials in the years leading up to, and even during, the Second World War. The absence of these papers is not a quiet void of personal sorrow, but a roaring silence that fundamentally challenges how we view this iconic couple. To understand the gravity of what might have been burned, we need to look at what we already know from the correspondence that survived or was intercepted. After the abdication, the couple embarked on a highly controversial tour, culminating in a visit to Germany in 1937. Photographs show them meeting a beaming Adolf Hitler, with the Duke giving a full Nazi salute. We have records of Wallis Simpson maintaining contact with German Ambassador Joachim von Ribbentrop while he was stationed in London, with Ribbentrop reportedly sending her 17 carnations a day. Most damningly, captured German diplomatic files, known as the Marburg Files, revealed after the war, contained telegrams from the German ambassador in Lisbon suggesting the Duke believed continued bombing of Britain would make the country ready for peace and that he might be reinstated as a puppet king after a German victory. These aren't whispers or rumors. They are documented pieces of a very troubling puzzle. The theory posits that the private, unvarnished telegrams between the Windsors and their Nazi contacts, the ones they controlled and could destroy, would have been the missing pieces that completed this picture, providing undeniable proof of their active sympathies and potentially even their willingness to collaborate. The decision to burn such evidence would have been a coldly pragmatic one. After the war, as the full horror of the Nazi regime came to light, any association with its leaders became a mark of profound shame and even treason. For the Duke and Duchess, who were desperate to regain some form of royal status, a financial settlement, and a glamorous position in high society, the existence of these documents was an existential threat. A single surviving telegram, written in the Duke's own hand, expressing agreement with Nazi ideology or criticizing the British war effort, would have annihilated them socially and politically. The fire, in this case, was a tool of reputation management on a global scale. It was an attempt to control their legacy, to ensure the history books would remember the romantic abdication rather than the distasteful and dangerous political dalliances that may have been a much stronger motivator for leaving the throne than love alone. The consequences of this alleged destruction are immense. Without the concrete, smoking gun evidence that the flames consumed, the Duke and Duchess have been able to occupy a nebulous, debated space in history. Defenders can chalk up their German visit to mere poor judgment and dismiss the Marburg Files as German propaganda or misinterpretation. The burned telegrams create a permanent shield of plausible deniability. But if those papers had survived, our perception of the entire abdication crisis might be turned on its head. Was Edward VIII's reluctance to take the advice of his government partly rooted in a sympathy for the authoritarian regimes rising in Europe? Did his relationship with Wallis Simpson, a woman with her own set of controversial and well-connected friends, facilitate a channel of communication that bordered on espionage? The absence of their personal, burned correspondence means we can only speculate, but it also strongly suggests they had something profoundly damaging to hide. Their legacy remains split, part fairy tale, part historical cautionary tale, all because a handful of paper was turned to ash, leaving us with haunting questions about the true price of a crown and the secrets a king chose to burn rather than face. Stepping back from the 20th century, we find another legendary bonfire of secrets, one that casts a long, dark shadow over the British Isles and involves one of history's most tragic and captivating figures, Mary, Queen of Scots. Her story is a whirlwind of romance, religious conflict, and brutal political machination, culminating in her execution at the orders of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England. But the legal and moral justification for that beheading rested almost entirely on a collection of documents that have since vanished from history, the infamous casket letters. While not all were consigned to flames, their mysterious disappearance and alleged destruction have created a historical black hole, a void of evidence that has allowed a debate over Mary's guilt to rage for more than 4 centuries, fundamentally altering our understanding of Scottish and English history. To grasp the gravity of these lost letters, you have to understand the explosive situation. Mary, a Catholic queen, had been forced to abdicate her Scottish throne in favor of her infant son, James, after a series of calamitous events, not least of which was the brutal murder of her second husband, Lord Darnley. She soon fled to England, throwing herself on the mercy of her Protestant cousin, Elizabeth. For Elizabeth, Mary's arrival was a political nightmare. As a Catholic claimant to the English throne, Mary instantly became the living, breathing focus for every plot to overthrow Elizabeth. The English queen needed a reason to keep Mary imprisoned indefinitely, but executing an anointed queen was a terrifying precedent she was deeply reluctant to set. Then a damning piece of evidence surfaced. Scottish lords who had opposed Mary produced a small silver casket. They claimed it was hers, and inside were 8 letters, purportedly written by Mary to the Earl of Bothwell, the man widely believed to have orchestrated Darnley's murder and who subsequently became her 3rd husband. The most incendiary of these, known as the Long Casket Letter, was a passionate, detailed love letter that seemed to implicate Mary directly in the plot to kill her own husband. The problem, the one that has tortured historians ever since, is that the originals of these letters disappeared. We only have copies and translations of copies produced by Mary's enemies. The ambiguity begins with the physical objects themselves. Did the silver casket even belong to Mary? Was the handwriting in the letters truly hers? The Scottish lords presented them to a tribunal, but Mary was never allowed to see them to verify their authenticity. She adamantly and consistently denied ever writing them, claiming they were vicious forgeries designed to destroy her reputation and justify her imprisonment. Without the original documents to subject to modern forensic analysis, the paper, the ink, the unique quirks of her penmanship, we are left in an impossible position. Or were they genuine, revealing a queen so blinded by passion and ambition that she conspired in regicide? Or were they brilliant, malicious fakes, a masterpiece of Elizabethan-era disinformation crafted to eliminate a rival? The destruction, or simply the loss, of the originals means we can never know for sure. This single act of disappearance, whether through deliberate burning, careless loss, or intentional hiding, has had profound and lasting consequences. It allowed Elizabeth to hold Mary captive for 19 years, a perpetual prisoner and a rallying point for Catholic rebellion. When a final plot against Elizabeth was uncovered, the casket letters, despite their questionable provenance, were used as a key part of the evidence to convict Mary of treason and sign her death warrant. Her execution in 1587 removed a major dynastic threat, but it also sent shockwaves through Europe, painting Elizabeth as a tyrant who murdered a fellow queen. The historical debate over Mary's character: was she a tragic victim of misogyny and political circumstance, or a cunning and morally compromised player who met a deserved fate, is entirely framed by the missing casket letters. If they were genuine, then her downfall was largely of her own making. If they were forgeries, then she was the victim of one of the most successful character assassinations in history. That unanswered question, born from the absence of a few sheets of paper, has shaped the narrative of two nations, forever leaving the truth about Mary, Queen of Scots, tantalizingly out of reach, a ghost story written in ink that we can no longer read. But this instinct to control a narrative through fire was not confined to the fading empires of old Europe. It found a powerful and heartbreaking echo in the late 20th century, in the life of one of the most photographed and documented women in the world, Diana, Princess of Wales. In the whirlwind of public adoration and relentless media scrutiny that defined her life, Diana maintained a deeply private world, one she often entrusted to the written page. She was a prolific letter writer, confiding in close friends, her butler Paul Burrell and her sons. Yet, swirling around her tragic death is a persistent and poignant speculation that she, too, engaged in her own acts of deliberate destruction. The theory suggests that Diana systematically destroyed a cache of intensely personal letters, journals, and notes that detailed the most vulnerable chapters of her life: the profound isolation within her marriage to Prince Charles, the details of her extramarital relationships, and her growing fears for her own safety in the years and months leading up to her death in Paris. Imagine the content of those vanished pages. This would not have been the carefully managed revelation of the Andrew Morton book, or the raw emotion of her BBC Panorama interview, both of which were public statements designed to shape her side of the story. The burned letters would have been the unguarded, unfiltered truth. They would have contained her most private despair, written in the dead of night, about the feeling of being trapped in a loveless union while performing the part of a fairy tale princess for the world. They might have held the specific, dated details of her affairs, not as scandalous gossip, but as confessions of a woman desperately seeking affection and validation. Most chillingly, given her later statements about being a victim of a campaign within the establishment, these documents could have contained her precise fears, names, incidents, and premonitions that she felt made her position precarious. By destroying them, she may have believed she was protecting herself, her sons, or the reputations of others. But in doing so, she created a vacuum of first-hand evidence that has had profound consequences. The absence of this definitive personal testimony has left Diana's entire narrative astonishingly open to interpretation and, at times, brutal manipulation. Without her own handwritten account to refer to, every player in her story, from the royal family and their advisors to the various men in her life and the army of journalists who covered her, has been able to advance their own version of events. Her story became a public canvas, and everyone picked up a brush. The British monarchy, in particular, has had to navigate the fallout from this informational void. In the immediate aftermath of her death, their initial reserved response was widely perceived as cold and out of touch, creating a massive public relations crisis that threatened the very stability of the institution. That crisis was born from a disconnect between the private reality the palace understood and the public's perception of Diana, a perception she had carefully cultivated, but whose deepest evidence she had taken with her. The people's princess belonged to the people, and in the lack of her own words, they crafted a mythos that the institution struggled to contend with. This manipulation continues to this day, fueling countless documentaries, books, and conspiracy theories. Every new revelation or interview is measured against a standard that no longer exists, Diana's own private truth. The mystery of what she actually wrote and then chose to burn empowers every narrative, from the sympathetic to the salacious. It has forced the modern monarchy into a perpetual dance of public relations, constantly working to manage the legacy of a woman whose own voice on the most critical matters is permanently silent. They must acknowledge her immense cultural impact and philanthropic work, while delicately sidestepping the more turbulent aspects of her life that she might have detailed in those lost letters. The fire, whether lit by Diana's own hand or by circumstance, ensured that the full, complicated story of the Princess of Wales would forever be a collection of fragments. We are left with the haunting image of a woman who mastered the art of public communication, yet whose most private truths remain a ghost in the machine, a whisper of ash that continues to shape the story of the House of Windsor. The world of European royalty and Gilded Age ambition collided with breathtaking force in the story of Consuelo Vanderbilt, a narrative where the burning of letters wasn't about state secrets, but about the systematic incineration of a young woman's heart. At the turn of the 20th century, America's new industrial aristocracy possessed staggering wealth, but they lacked the one thing money couldn't easily buy in New York: ancient, unimpeachable social status. For the ruthless social climbers like Alva Vanderbilt, the solution lay across the Atlantic, in the grand, but often financially crumbling, estates of the British aristocracy. It was a simple, cynical transaction, American dollars for British titles. And Alva was determined that her daughter, Consuelo, would be her masterpiece, her ticket into the highest echelons of the old world. But Consuelo possessed her own will and her own affections, a reality her mother was prepared to literally burn out of her. From a young age, Consuelo was groomed for this single purpose. Her life was a prison of tutors, deportment lessons, and a steel-reinforced corset, all designed to sculpt her into the perfect ducal bride. She was beautiful, cultured, and fabulously wealthy, the ultimate prize. Yet she had fallen in love with a perfectly suitable but socially unacceptable American man named Winthrop Rutherford. Their courtship was conducted in secret, through a series of tender letters that represented her only glimpse of a future chosen for herself, not for her family's ambition. When Alva discovered this correspondence, she didn't merely forbid the relationship. She orchestrated a ritual of destruction designed to sever Consuelo's emotional ties completely. She forced her daughter to take the bundle of Rutherford's letters and cast them, one by one, into the fireplace. Imagine the scene: a teenage girl standing before the fire, watching the physical evidence of her only happiness curl and blacken into nothingness. This was not just a punishment, it was a powerful symbolic act. With each letter consumed by the flames, Alva was demonstrating that Consuelo's personal desires were as disposable as ash, and that her value existed only as a conduit for the Vanderbilt fortune and social aspirations. The marriage that followed was as cold and calculated as the fire was hot. In 1895, a visibly distressed Consuelo, often described as weeping behind her veil, was marched down the aisle of St. Thomas Episcopal Church in New York to marry the 9th Duke of Marlborough. The Duke, for his part, was not marrying for love, but for the millions of Vanderbilt dollars that would rescue his ancestral home, Blenheim Palace, from decay. It was a transaction in which Consuelo was the primary commodity. The union was miserable from the start. The Duke was remote and unfaithful, and Consuelo was trapped in a gilded cage of immense privilege and profound loneliness. The burning of those letters had achieved its goal. It had cleared the path for a socially triumphant marriage, but it had also incinerated the very possibility of personal fulfillment for the young heiress. The consequences of this single domestic act of destruction rippled out far beyond a sad marriage. The Vanderbilt-Marlborough alliance became one of the most famous and successful of these so-called dollar princess unions, a glittering symbol of the transatlantic merger of new money and old blood. It helped cement a cultural and financial alliance between the American elite and the British aristocracy that would have significant diplomatic repercussions for decades, creating powerful networks that influenced politics and society on both sides of the ocean. Yet for Consuelo, the cost was her entire youth. She eventually found the courage to escape, securing one of the era's most sensational divorces, and later finding genuine love and purpose in philanthropy and activism. But the story of the burned letters remains a stark, haunting emblem of the Gilded Age. It illustrates with painful clarity how the personal was so often sacrificed for the dynastic, and how the flames in a New York fireplace could snuff out one woman's future to fuel the ambitions of an entire social class. While the Vanderbilt marriage was a very public transaction, the Astor family, whose name was synonymous with New York high society itself, understood that the most dangerous threats often arrived not in the society pages, but in plain, unmarked envelopes delivered by a discreet servant. In the rarefied air of Gilded Age New York, where names like Astor and Vanderbilt were the closest America came to royalty, reputation was a currency more valuable than any stock portfolio or real estate holding. It was a fragile construct, built on a foundation of public propriety, and it could be shattered by a single whispered rumor. This created the perfect environment for a shadow economy of blackmail to flourish, preying on the immense pressure to maintain a flawless facade. It is within this pressure cooker of social ambition and fear that we find the tantalizing story of an Astor heiress, and the letters she may have been forced to burn. The Astor dynasty, built first on the fur trade and then massively expanded through relentless real estate acquisition in Manhattan, stood at the absolute pinnacle of this world. Mrs. Carolina Astor, the undisputed queen of New York society, ruled from her throne at the Astor Mansion on Fifth Avenue, her famous 400 list determining who was, and more importantly, who was not socially acceptable. For a woman in this family, especially a young, unmarried heiress, the expectations were suffocating. Her value was intrinsically tied to her purity, her obedience, and her suitability for a brilliant marriage that would further cement the family's power. Any deviation from this rigid path, a secret romance, an indiscreet confession in a letter, a hint of scandal, was not just a personal failing. It was a direct threat to the financial and social stability of the entire Astor empire. A tarnished reputation could scuttle a business merger, close the doors of the best clubs, and render a multi-million-dollar fortune socially worthless. The specific rumors that have trickled down through history are often vague, which is precisely the point successful destruction leaves few traces. They tend to center around a particular heiress, often identified as one of the more independent-minded daughters or nieces in the extended family, who possessed a spirit not easily crushed by Gilded Age convention. The theory suggests that this young woman, perhaps during her travels in Europe, or through a forbidden connection in New York itself, engaged in a correspondence that crossed the line of propriety. These might have been love letters to a man deemed unsuitable, perhaps an artist or a fortune hunter. Or even more dangerously, they could have contained confidences about her own frustrations with her gilded cage, criticisms of her powerful relatives, or revelations about a private health matter. However innocent or passionate these letters may have been in their original intent, in the wrong hands they became a weapon. The moment of crisis would have arrived quietly. A demand for money, accompanied by the threat to forward copies of the letters to her parents, to the newspapers, or to the most vicious gossips in Mrs. Astor's circle. For the Astor patriarchs, this was not a personal drama. It was a corporate crisis. Paying the blackmailer was always a temporary and risky solution, as it could invite further demands. The only permanent, fail-safe solution was to eliminate the evidence itself. The decision to burn the letters would not have been an emotional one, but a cold, strategic business calculation. The heiress, likely under immense family pressure, would have been instructed to retrieve every last page of the incriminating correspondence. The act of burning them in the fireplace of a grand library or a private boudoir was a ritual of purification and protection. It was the family reclaiming control, ensuring that no physical proof of the transgression could ever resurface to haunt them. The consequences of this fiery act were profound, yet completely invisible to the outside world. The public saw only the continuation of Astor prestige, the magnificent balls, the charitable galas, the strategic marriages. The heiress in question would have gone on to make the socially advantageous match that was always her destiny, her past safely entombed in ash. But the personal cost was immense. The destruction of those letters symbolized the final surrender of her personal desires to the demands of the dynasty. It was a brutal lesson in the fact that her individuality was subordinate to the family name. This story, repeated in various forms across many Gilded Age mansions, reveals the dark underbelly of extreme wealth and social ambition. The Astors and their peers didn't just build palaces of marble and gold. They also maintained them by diligently tending the fires that consumed their most inconvenient truths, ensuring that their public legacies would remain as spotless and imposing as the facades of their Fifth Avenue homes. Transitioning from the world of American heiresses and blackmail, we arrive at the very epicenter of 18th century power, where the burning of letters was not a matter of personal reputation, but of state security and dynastic survival. Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, one of the most formidable monarchs of her age, ruled the vast Habsburg Empire for 40 years with an iron will and a profound sense of duty. She was the ultimate matriarch, managing not only a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire, but also the lives and marriages of her 16 children, whom she famously referred to as a brood of 16 nestlings. For Maria Theresa, every aspect of her family's existence was a matter of statecraft, and private correspondence was perhaps the most dangerous weapon of all. She maintained an almost obsessive level of control over the letters flowing in and out of her court, and it is within this controlled environment that we find one of history's most systematic and consequential campaigns of document destruction, a program designed to burn away any evidence that could weaken her family's grip on power, particularly concerning her most famous and tragic daughter, Marie Antoinette. Maria Theresa's approach to governance was deeply personal and micromanaging. She read countless dispatches, penned numerous letters of instruction to her ambassadors and ministers, and expected absolute obedience from her children, who were essentially pawns in her grand diplomatic chessboard. Their marriages were strategic alliances meant to secure the Habsburg borders and contain the growing power of rivals like Prussia. When her youngest daughter, Maria Antonia, was chosen to marry the future King Louis XVI of France, sealing a fragile peace between the historic enemies Austria and France, the Empress embarked on a relentless letter-writing campaign to the girl, who would become Marie Antoinette. These letters, many of which survive, are a masterclass in maternal control disguised as advice. They are filled with constant warnings about etiquette, piety, and loyalty to Austria. But this vast surviving correspondence is likely only one side of the story. Maria Theresa employed a network of spies and informants, including the Austrian ambassador to France, the Comte de Mercy Argenteau, who provided her with detailed, secret reports on her daughter's every move, from her spending habits to the state of her unconsummated marriage. The Empress's replies to these reports, the ones containing her rawest frustrations, her most cynical political calculations, and her private fears about Marie Antoinette's frivolity and inability to navigate the treacherous waters of Versailles, are the ones that almost certainly met the fire. Consider what those burned replies would have revealed. They would have shown the Empress not as a concerned mother, but as a ruthless political operator. In them, she likely gave Mercy Argenteau explicit and potentially embarrassing instructions on how to manipulate her daughter, how to counter the influence of rival factions at the French court, and how to advance Austrian interests even when they were detrimental to France. She might have expressed her true opinion of King Louis, whom she considered weak, or her contempt for the licentious French courtiers she held responsible for corrupting her child. Most damagingly, these burned letters could have contained evidence of Maria Theresa directly using her daughter as a spy, urging her to pass along French state secrets. The existence of such instructions would have been a political atom bomb if discovered by the French, providing undeniable proof that their queen was a foreign agent, a charge that would later become a central pillar of the revolutionary propaganda against her. By systematically destroying this side of the correspondence, Maria Theresa was protecting the Austro-French alliance and, by extension, the stability of Europe. She was ensuring that only the sanitized maternal version of her counsel would remain for posterity. This calculated destruction had a catastrophic, if unintended, consequence. It effectively lobotomized the historical record of Marie Antoinette's early years at Versailles. We have Mercy Argenteau's detailed reports describing the problems, but we lack the Empress's most candid reactions and commands. This creates a void that was eagerly filled by her enemies. Without the full context of the manipulative pressure she was under from Vienna, Marie Antoinette's actions, her extravagant parties, her rejection of court formality, her seemingly frivolous circle of friends, could be framed not as the behavior of a young, isolated woman struggling under immense expectations, but as evidence of a fundamentally depraved and unpatriotic character. The revolutionary pamphleteers in France would later have a field day with this image, fabricating stories of affairs and conspiracy that were far worse than the reality. The absence of Maria Theresa's most incriminating letters made these lies easier to believe. The Empress, in her quest to control the narrative and hide the extent of her own political machinations, inadvertently made her daughter a more vulnerable target. The smoke from the fires she lit in Vienna ultimately helped cloud the air in Paris, obscuring the true nature of the Habsburg influence and leaving Marie Antoinette to face the fury of the revolution with a reputation already poisoned by half-truths and the ghost of letters that could have told a more complicated and perhaps more sympathetic story. And so we come to the most heart-wrenching fire of all, the one that consumed not the political machinations of rulers, but the final, fleeting words of their innocent children. The story of the Romanov family's final months is a chronicle of increasing isolation and fear, a slow-motion tragedy set within the confined walls of the Ipatiev house in Ekaterinburg. We know the broad strokes from history books and the accounts of their guards, but the most intimate record of that time, the diaries and letters of the four Grand Duchesses, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their brother, the Tsarevich Alexei, was largely lost to deliberate destruction in the chaotic days surrounding their murders. While some of their earlier writings survive, the notebooks and correspondence from their captivity represent a profound historical silence, a stolen conversation with the young lives at the very center of the storm. To understand the magnitude of this loss, you must first see the Romanov children not as distant icons of a lost empire, but as the vibrant, distinct individuals they were. Olga, the thoughtful and sensitive eldest, Tatiana, the practical and organized governess who helped manage the family's affairs, Maria, the kind-hearted and physically strong beauty, and Anastasia, the irrepressible whirlwind of mischief and energy. And then there was Alexei, the long-awaited heir, whose severe hemophilia cast a constant shadow of anxiety over the entire household. During their captivity, writing became a vital lifeline, a way to impose order on the terrifying uncertainty of their situation. They kept diaries, they wrote notes to each other, and they attempted to smuggle letters to the outside world, to loyal friends and faithful retainers. These documents would have given us an unparalleled, real-time account of their psychological state, not as a monolithic family unit, but as 5 unique young people processing their world collapsing around them. Consider what those burned pages might have contained. For Alexei, his lost diary would have been especially poignant. Confined to a wheelchair or his bed for much of their imprisonment due to his debilitating condition, his writings would have offered a window into the mind of a boy who knew he was the heir to a throne that no longer existed. How did he grapple with his physical helplessness while his father was being stripped of power? Did he confide his fears about his next hemorrhage or his frustrations at being unable to protect his sisters? His perspective on the guards, the changing political news, and his own evolving understanding of their fate would have been a uniquely tragic historical document. Similarly, the diaries of the Grand Duchesses would have chronicled their rapid maturation under pressure. We know from fragments that they took turns nursing Alexei, helped their mother with her correspondence, and tried to maintain a semblance of routine. Their lost words would have detailed their relationships with the few remaining loyal guards, the ones who sometimes showed them kindness, a complex dynamic utterly lost in the simple narrative of prisoners and jailers. The most significant erasure, however, lies in the realm of their inner spiritual and emotional lives. The Romanovs, particularly Alexandra and her daughters, leaned heavily on their deep Orthodox faith to endure their ordeal. Their lost writings would have been saturated with their prayers, their reflections on Scripture, and their struggle to find meaning and forgiveness in their suffering. We would have seen firsthand how their faith evolved from a comfortable state religion into a raw, desperate source of strength. Furthermore, these diaries were likely the only place where they allowed themselves to be completely candid about their fear. The sound of trucks arriving at night, the increasingly hostile shouts from outside, the ominous change in the guards' demeanor in those final weeks, all of this would have been recorded in their private pages with a chilling, unvarnished honesty. The decision by their captors to destroy these records was likely a final act of ideological erasure, an attempt to eliminate not just the physical remnants of the Romanovs, but the very evidence of their humanity. The consequence of this destruction is that our view of the Romanov children remains frustratingly two-dimensional. They are often remembered through the lens of their brutal end, or through the idealized, formal portraits taken in happier times. The vibrant, intelligent, and complex individuals they were in their final year is a ghost we can only glimpse through the brief, censored letters that did survive and the second-hand accounts of those who held them captive. The burned diaries and letters of the Romanov children represent more than just a lost historical source. They are the stolen voice of youth itself in the face of overwhelming darkness. Their absence forces us to forever wonder about the final thoughts of a young man who never became Tsar, and the last words of 4 sisters whose lives were cut brutally short, leaving their incredible story of courage and resilience hauntingly and permanently incomplete. The world of British aristocracy and American ambition found one of its most dazzling and controversial figures in Jenny Jerome, the woman who would become Lady Randolph Churchill, and most famously, the mother of Winston Churchill. Born in Brooklyn to a wealthy and socially ambitious financier, Leonard Jerome, Jenny was raised with all the confidence and fire of New York's Gilded Age elite. She was brilliant, beautiful, and possessed a magnetic charm that captivated almost everyone she met. Her marriage to Lord Randolph Churchill, the younger son of the Duke of Marlborough, was a classic dollar princess union, injecting fresh American money and vitality into an ancient British line. But Jenny was no passive heiress. She was a force of nature, a political hostess of unparalleled skill, and a woman with a voracious appetite for life, love, and influence. And it is within this whirlwind of glamour and power that we find a compelling historical mystery: the curious gaps in her personal correspondence, and the strong likelihood that she, or those protecting her legacy, systematically purged her papers of anything that could have ruined her son's meteoric political rise. To understand why such destruction would be necessary, you have to appreciate the sheer scale of Jenny's indiscretions, which were breathtaking even by the relatively tolerant standards of the late Victorian and Edwardian aristocracy. While she was a devoted and influential mother to Winston, fiercely promoting his career from its earliest days, her own personal life was a continuous source of scandal. Her marriage to Lord Randolph was notoriously unstable, with both taking numerous lovers. After his early death from syphilis, Jenny's life became even more liberated. She had a long and public affair with the dashing Count Charles Kinsky, an Austrian cavalry officer, and later married two much younger men, shocking society each time. Her name was linked to dozens of prominent figures, including the future King Edward VII. Beyond her romantic entanglements, she was perpetually in debt, living far beyond her means and engaging in risky financial schemes that frequently required bailouts from her family or wealthy friends. In an era where politics and high society were intimately entwined, a mother with such a reputation was not just an embarrassment. She was an active liability. For a son trying to build a reputation as a serious, reliable statesman, the gossip surrounding Jenny was a ticking time bomb. The evidence for a deliberate campaign of censorship is found not in a single bonfire, but in the conspicuous silence of the archives. Jenny was a prolific writer and a central figure in a vast social network. She must have written and received thousands of letters over her lifetime. Yet, when historians examine the surviving Churchill family papers, the record of Jenny's most private life is surprisingly sanitized. The letters that remain largely concern her unwavering support for Winston, her observations on politics, and her social maneuvering. The raw, intimate, and potentially damning correspondence, the passionate love letters to Kinsky, the frantic notes to money lenders, the confessional exchanges with her closest female friends about her affairs, these have largely vanished. This is not likely an accident. The most plausible explanation is that Jenny herself, with her sharp political instincts, began the process, destroying the most incriminating evidence in her possession. Later, after her death, her son Winston and his team would have had every motivation to continue this work, carefully curating the family archive to protect the Churchill brand and ensure that the great man's origin story remained one of bulldog determination, not maternal scandal. Consider the alternative had these letters survived and become public during Winston's early career. In the fiercely moralistic, though often hypocritical, political climate of the time, opponents would have had a field day. Imagine the headlines: the son of a woman who cavorted with European counts and lived a life of financial impropriety. The attacks would not have been subtle. They would have questioned his judgment, his respectability, and his very Britishness by constantly highlighting his American mother's loose morals. In the high-stakes game of British politics, where perception is everything, this could have been crippling. It could have prevented him from obtaining his first ministerial posts, alienated key allies, and provided endless ammunition for his many enemies. The destruction of these papers was, therefore, not an act of shame, but one of strategic necessity. It was a cold, calculated decision to remove a vulnerability, much like a general securing his supply lines before a battle. Jenny's burning of her own past was perhaps the ultimate act of maternal devotion, ensuring that her son's future would not be haunted by the specter of her own vibrant, unapologetic, and politically inconvenient life. Yet the impulse to burn away inconvenient truths was hardly confined to the palaces and parlors of Europe. It found a powerful and shameful expression in the very heart of American democracy. In a scandal so brazen, it became the benchmark for political corruption for generations. The Teapot Dome affair of the early 1920s is often taught as a simple story of bribery and oil reserves. But lurking beneath the courtroom drama and congressional hearings is a darker, more familiar thread: the deliberate, calculated destruction of evidence through fire, an act that connects the Gilded Age's obsession with controlling narratives directly to the highest levels. United States government. This wasn't about royal succession or a princess's reputation. It was about using flames to obscure a trail of corruption that led straight to the White House, forever altering the public's trust in its leaders. To understand the gravity of the burned documents, you first have to grasp the sheer scale of the theft. The scandal centered on two vast, federally owned oil fields, one in Wyoming, nicknamed Teapot Dome for its distinctive rock formation, and another in California. These reserves were set aside for the U.S. Navy, a strategic emergency supply meant to fuel the fleet in times of war. In 1921, President Warren G. Harding's Secretary of the Interior, a man named Albert B. Fall, convinced the Secretary of the Navy to transfer control of these priceless oil fields from the Navy Department to his own Interior Department. He argued it was for efficiency, but his true motive was far more venal. Once in control, Fall secretly leased the Teapot Dome Reserve to Harry F. Sinclair's Mammoth Oil Company and the California fields to Edward L. Doheny's Pan American Petroleum and Transport Company. These were no-bid contracts, arranged behind closed doors, and in return for this incredible favor, the two oil magnates provided Fall with a flood of cash and no interest loans that he used to purchase a sprawling New Mexico ranch, among other luxuries. It was a breathtaking heist of national property, carried out by a cabinet secretary. The scandal began to unravel thanks to the dogged work of journalists and a Senate investigation led by Senator Thomas J. Walsh. As the net tightened around Albert Fall, the need to hide the evidence became desperate. This is where the fire enters the story, not as a metaphor, but as a literal tool of obstruction. It is widely documented that Fall, in a panic, ordered his subordinates to burn a significant portion of his official correspondence and financial records. Imagine the scene in a government office. Files and ledgers that detailed meetings with Sinclair and Doheny, memos about the lease transfers, and perhaps even personal financial statements, all fed into a furnace or a fireplace. This was not an emotional purge of personal letters. It was a cold, deliberate act of criminal cover-up, designed to eliminate the paper trail that connected the bribes to the leases. The burning of these executive branch documents was a direct attack on the idea of governmental transparency and accountability. It was an attempt to use fire as a shield against the consequences of treasonous greed. Connecting this back to our broader theme, the wealthy and powerful players in this drama were very much the heirs to the Gilded Age mentality. Edward Doheny was a classic robber baron, a man who had amassed a colossal fortune in oil and lived with the kind of ostentatious wealth that would have made any Vanderbilt or Astor feel right at home. Harry Sinclair was a ruthless businessman who moved in the highest financial circles. Their world was one where money could buy anything, including, they believed, a cabinet secretary and the energy reserves of the United States government. When that transaction was threatened with exposure, they resorted to the same method their social counterparts across the Atlantic used to protect dynastic secrets. They tried to burn the evidence. The fire in Washington, D.C. was kin to the fires in Vienna and St. Petersburg. It was the universal tool for those who believed they were above the law, a desperate attempt to turn undeniable proof into harmless, untraceable ash. The consequences of this destruction were profound, yet they also highlight the resilience of justice. Even without the full body of evidence, the Senate investigation and subsequent criminal trials were able to piece together the story through bank records, the testimony of lesser players, and the sheer magnitude of Fall's sudden wealth. Albert B. Fall became the first former cabinet official in American history to be convicted of a felony and sentenced to prison for his actions in office. Harry Sinclair was charged with contempt of Congress and conspiracy, and while he served a short jail sentence, the scandal forever tarnished his empire. The Teapot Dome scandal became a permanent stain on the Harding administration and a defining moment in American political history, leading to greater scrutiny of government contracts and a strengthening of congressional oversight. It proved that while the powerful could burn papers, they could not always incinerate the truth. The ghost of those burned documents, however, lingers in the historical record, a stark reminder that when the smoke clears, the desire to hide corruption is a constant thread weaving through the tapestry of power, from the gilded halls of emperors to the marbled offices of a modern democracy. While the Teapot Dome scandal revealed how fire could shield political corruption, another blaze, lit decades earlier in the lavish halls of Carlton House, was fueled by a far more personal kind of desperation, the conflict between a king's heart and his duty to the crown. This is the story of King George IV, a monarch remembered for his extravagant tastes and dissolute lifestyle, and the one woman he truly loved, a Catholic widow named Maria Fitzherbert. Their relationship was not just a scandalous affair. It was a secret, illegal marriage that flew in the face of the very laws governing the British monarchy, an act of passion whose proof was systematically fed into the flames to protect a throne. The decision to burn their marriage certificate and related letters was a brutal act of self-preservation that secured his royal future. but at the cost of his personal happiness, creating a legacy of profound misery that festered beneath the glittering royal facade for the rest of his life. To grasp the sheer impossibility of this union, you have to understand the two formidable legal barriers George faced. First was the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, a law passed by his own father, King George III. This act explicitly stated that no descendant of the monarch could marry without the sovereign's formal consent before the age of 25. After that age, they could marry without consent, but only if they gave 12 months' notice to the Privy Council and provided that neither House of Parliament expressed disapproval. George IV, then the Prince of Wales, was only 22 when he fell for Maria Fitzherbert, and he knew his father would never, under any circumstances, grant permission. The second, and even more insurmountable, barrier was the Act of Settlement of 1701. This was the bedrock law that ensured a Protestant succession to the British throne, and it explicitly barred anyone who married a Catholic from ever inheriting the crown. Maria Fitzherbert was not only a commoner, but she was also a devout Catholic. For the heir to the throne to marry her was not just an act of rebellion. It was, in the eyes of the law, an act of political suicide that would have legally disqualified him from becoming king. The very existence of their marriage was a direct threat to the stability of the Hanoverian dynasty. Yet, the prince's obsession with Maria was all-consuming. He was a young man drowning in debt and emotional turmoil, and he saw in her a stability and warmth utterly absent from his life. He pursued her with a dramatic fervor that included a faked suicide attempt, reportedly having his friends tell her he would stab himself if she did not relent. Whether out of genuine affection, pity, or a combination of both, Maria finally agreed. On the 15th of December, 1785, in a lavish drawing room at her London home, a ceremony was performed by an Anglican priest they had bribed. They exchanged vows, signed a marriage certificate, and Maria Fitzherbert, in her heart, became his wife. For a time, they lived in a kind of secret bliss. Maria was accepted by the prince's inner circle, and he treated her with the devotion of a husband. But this fragile happiness existed in the shadow of a terrifying reality. The document they had signed, along with the passionate love letters that passed between them, were not just mementos. They were high treasonous artifacts. In the wrong hands, they were weapons that could be used to not only destroy George's claim to the throne, but also potentially plunge the nation into a constitutional crisis. The moment of reckoning arrived years later, as the prince's debts spiraled to astronomical levels and the pressure from his father and the government intensified. To secure a massive parliamentary grant to pay off his creditors, he was forced to make a devastating bargain. The government, led by the Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, made it clear that the financial rescue package was contingent on him formally renouncing Maria Fitzherbert and ending their relationship. More than that, he was compelled to destroy the evidence. The physical proof of their marriage had to disappear. We can only imagine the scene, the Prince of Wales, perhaps in the very room where he was married, being forced to take the cherished marriage certificate and the bundle of Maria's most intimate letters and consign them to the fireplace. This was not a gentle, symbolic act. It was a state-mandated execution of his own happiness. Each curling piece of paper, each fragment of ink turning to ash, represented the systematic dismantling of the one authentic relationship of his life, all sacrificed for the cold, hard demands of a crown he was not yet even wearing. The psychological consequences of this fiery betrayal were catastrophic and lifelong. George never recovered from the loss of Maria. Though they briefly reconciled years later, the fundamental bond of trust had been incinerated along with the documents. He went on to contract a legally sanctioned, publicly celebrated, and utterly loathsome marriage to his cousin, Caroline of Brunswick. That union was a spectacular failure from the start, marked by mutual disgust and public scandal, and it produced only one child, Princess Charlotte, whose tragic death in childbirth later created its own succession crisis. George's life devolved into a pattern of gluttony, artistic patronage, and bitter isolation. He became a king who was widely disliked, a figure of ridicule and scorn. The burning of those letters and the marriage certificate created a void in his soul that no amount of royal pomp or privilege could ever fill. He had secured his throne by destroying the evidence of his heart, and he was forever haunted by the ghost of the life he could have had with the woman he was forced to renounce. This single act of destruction also sent ripples through the very line of succession he sought to protect. By being forced apart from Maria, George entered into his disastrous marriage with Caroline. The failure of that marriage to produce a healthy, surviving heir, compounded by the death of his only legitimate child, Princess Charlotte, meant that the crown ultimately passed to his brother, William IV, and then to his niece, Victoria. The personal misery born from that fire in Carlton House directly altered the dynastic trajectory of the British monarchy. The story of George IV and Maria Fitzherbert stands as one of history's most poignant examples of how the demands of royalty could crush private happiness. It reveals that the most dangerous fires were not always those that threatened palaces or state secrets, but the intimate flames lit under a personal promise, where a king chose his duty over his love and spent the rest of his magnificent, miserable reign warming his hands over the ashes of what might have been. But if you thought the calculated fires of royalty and the strategic bonfires of the Astores represented the height of Gilded Age scandal, you haven't yet encountered the story that truly set the 20th century ablaze. A tale of obsession, architecture, and murder that came to be known as the Girl in the Red Velvet Swing. This was the scandal of Evelyn Nesbit, a chorus girl of ethereal beauty whose life became a public spectacle. And at the heart of it all lies the tantalizing possibility that another crucial set of letters was deliberately fed to the flames. While the tragedies of empires unfolded overseas, America was gripped by a courtroom drama where the fate of a millionaire hung not just on a lawyer's eloquence, but on the absence of evidence that might have burned in a fireplace months before. To understand the gravity of those potentially lost letters, you must first step into the dazzling, decadent world of Stanford White. He was the preeminent architect of his era, the man who designed the Washington Square Arch and much of Madison Square Garden, a palace of entertainment that featured a private rooftop apartment he called his Sin Suite. White was a titan of New York society, a man with an insatiable appetite for art, parties, and young women. It was into this orbit that he drew Evelyn Nesbit, a stunningly beautiful artist's model and chorus girl from Pittsburgh, who was just 16 years old when she caught his eye. White became her patron, introducing her to a world of unimaginable luxury, before allegedly drugging and assaulting her in that infamous rooftop apartment, an event she would later describe in court with devastating effect. This was the first act of the tragedy, a violation that festered and would eventually trigger a shocking act of vengeance. The story twists with the entrance of Harry Kendall Thaw, a wildly unstable Pittsburgh multimillionaire heir who became obsessively infatuated with Evelyn. Thaw represented old money, but he was also plagued by rumors of sadism and drug addiction, a man known for violent, unpredictable rages. He eventually married Evelyn, but he could never escape the shadow of Stanford White, whom he referred to as a beast who had defiled his wife. Thaw's obsession with White curdled into a murderous fury, culminating on the night of June 25th, 1906. Under the dazzling roof of Madison Square Garden, a building White himself had designed during a performance of the musical Mamselle Champagne, Thaw walked up to White's table, raised a pistol, and shot the architect 3 times in the face at point-blank range, in front of hundreds of horrified witnesses. The Gilded Age had never seen a public murder so brazen, and the press immediately dubbed it the crime of the century. The ensuing trial was a media circus of unprecedented proportions, and it was here that Evelyn Nesbit, now Thaw's wife, became the star witness. Her testimony was a masterclass in performance and pathos. Dressed in demure, schoolgirl-like outfits, she captivated the jury with her story of White's initial assault and her husband's chivalrous, if unhinged, mission to avenge her honor. The defense strategy, orchestrated by Thaw's brilliant and expensive legal team, was ingenious. They portrayed Harry Thaw as temporarily insane, driven to an act of dementia Americana by the righteous need to protect his wife's virtue from a predatory monster. Evelyn was the perfect catalyst for this narrative, but this is where the mystery of the burned letters enters the picture. Throughout her relationship with both White and Thaw, Evelyn was a prolific correspondent. She wrote and received countless letters, love notes, confessions, desperate pleas, and potentially detailed accounts of her life with the volatile Thaw. The theory suggests that in the frantic days following the murder, as Thaw's legal team prepared their insanity defense, they would have scrutinized every piece of paper in Evelyn's possession. Letters that depicted Thaw's own depravity, his drug use, or his premeditated plans to kill White would have been catastrophic to their case. Even more dangerously, what if there were letters from Stanford White himself that contained apologies, explanations, or a different version of the events in the rooftop apartment? What if they revealed that the relationship was more complex than the simple tale of predator and victim the defense was presenting? The existence of such documents would have provided the prosecution with the means to shred the avenging angel narrative and paint Thaw as a cold-blooded, calculating killer and Evelyn as a compliant or opportunistic figure. The only way to ensure these alternate narratives never saw the light of day was to destroy them. The act of burning this correspondence would have been a clinical legal maneuver, a way to curate the evidence that would shape the entire trial. The consequences of this alleged destruction were immense. Without any contradictory documentary evidence, Evelyn's heartbreaking testimony from the witness stand stood unchallenged. The jury deadlocked in the first trial, but in a second, Thaw was found not guilty by reason of insanity and confined to an asylum for the criminally insane. He was later released, his fortune and connections having secured his freedom. The trial fundamentally changed courtroom strategy, showcasing the raw power of a sympathetic witness in a narrative that could overwhelm factual evidence. It demonstrated that in the court of public opinion, and by extension in a jury box, a well-told story could absolve even the most public of crimes. The burning of Evelyn Nesbit's letters, if it occurred, ensured that only one version of the story would be told, a version that saved a murderer from the electric chair and cemented a legend. The case left an indelible mark, proving that sometimes the most powerful evidence in a courtroom is not what is presented, but what is missing. The ghost of letters that went up in smoke, leaving behind a truth forever obscured by the very flames meant to provide clarity. And so we arrive at a form of destruction that strikes at the very core of wealth and lineage, not the burning of love letters or state secrets, but the cold, calculated incineration of a last will and testament. While the flames of passion and politics consumed personal reputations, the fire that greeted a legal document could obliterate fortunes, rewrite family trees, and ignite bitter wars of succession that spanned generations. This was destruction as a final, posthumous act of control, a way for the powerful to reach from beyond the grave and impose their will, or for the ambitious to erase that will entirely. The stakes were not merely sentimental. They were measured in millions of dollars, vast estates, and the very dynastic legacy that the Gilded Age elite and European nobility had spent their lives building. Consider the immense power held within a single, signed piece of paper. A will is more than a list of bequests. It is the ultimate declaration of a person's final intentions, a blueprint for the future of their entire empire. In an era of sprawling, complex families with legitimate heirs, illegitimate children, jealous siblings, and scheming business partners, the contents of a will were often the most explosively anticipated secret in high society. To burn such a document was to create a legal and financial vacuum, a void where the clear wishes of the deceased were replaced by the murky rules of intestacy or the contested claims of rivals. For European nobility, this could mean a dukedom passing to a distant, unprepared cousin instead of a cherished daughter. For an American robber baron, it could mean a business empire splintering into chaos or falling into the hands of a despised competitor. The motivation to destroy a will was always rooted in a potent mixture of greed, vengeance, and a desperate desire to control a narrative even after death. The annals of European aristocracy are filled with whispers of such fiery acts. One of the most persistent legends surrounds the death of a powerful 19th century nobleman, a man with a tangled web of children from multiple marriages and a fortune built on land and titles. The story goes that upon his deathbed, he summoned his eldest son and his lawyer to finalize a new will that sought to make amends, perhaps leaving significant bequests to children from a first marriage who had been previously disinherited, or to a secret mistress. This new document, however, threatened the inheritance of the second wife and her children, who had spent years consolidating their influence. In the chaotic and emotionally charged hours following the nobleman's passing, the story alleges that the new will mysteriously vanished, with only the older, more favorable version remaining to be presented to the courts. The implication, of course, is that the threatened heirs committed the ultimate act of betrayal, burning the updated will, to ensure their own financial survival. Without the physical document, the disinherited relatives had no legal leg to stand on, their claims dismissed as the fantasies of bitter also-rans. A family schism was cemented, and a fortune was redirected based on a lie that turned to ash. This pattern of disappearance played out with even higher stakes across the Atlantic, where the self-made fortunes of America's industrial titans were often just as fiercely contested as any ancient aristocratic inheritance. The case of the railroad magnate Collies P. Huntington provides a textbook example of how the absence of a final will could create a legal firestorm. Huntington, one of the Big Four who built the Central Pacific Railroad, died in 1900 with an estate valued at around $40 million, a staggering sum for the time. He had prepared a will, but it was a deeply controversial document that left the bulk of his fortune to his second wife, Arabella, and sidelined his adopted son, Henry Edwards Huntington. The will was challenged, and in the ensuing legal battle, an incredible allegation surfaced that a second, more recent will had been created, one that was far more generous to Henry and other relatives. Supporters of Henry claimed this later will had been suppressed, and they strongly hinted destroyed. Although the case was ultimately settled out of court, the cloud of suspicion never fully lifted. The ghost of that missing second will haunted the family for years, a phantom document that, if it ever existed, would have completely rewritten the distribution of one of America's greatest Gilded Age fortunes. The fire in this scenario wasn't just about money. It was about shaping the legacy of a dynasty and determining who would control the levers of immense economic power for the next generation. Perhaps no story captures the brutal finality of a burned will more starkly than the tragic tale of an American mining heiress from the early 20th century. Isolated and emotionally fragile, she had drafted a will leaving her entire fortune to a handful of loyal friends and charitable causes, explicitly cutting out a circle of distant, avaricious relatives who had shown her little kindness during her life. When she died unexpectedly, those relatives descended upon her estate. In the inventory of her personal effects, a trusted maid reported seeing a metal lockbox that was now empty. The heiress had often spoken of keeping her important papers in that box. The family, however, presented only a much older will, one written decades prior when she was on better terms with them, which bequeathed them the entirety of her wealth. The maid's testimony about the lockbox was dismissed as unreliable, and the family walked away with millions. While it could never be proven in a court of law, the overwhelming suspicion was that the true, final will had been found and immediately burned, its existence erased as thoroughly as if it had never been written at all. The heiress's last wishes were silenced, her intended beneficiaries left with nothing, and her fortune became the property of the very people she sought to disinherit. In this intimate, domestic drama, the fireplace became an instrument of profound injustice, demonstrating that the power to destroy a document could be the power to steal a future. From the courtroom dramas and burned wills of America's Gilded Age, we now turn our attention to a more insidious kind of fire, one that may have burned not to hide a crime, but to conceal a biological curse woven into the very fabric of European royalty. The private correspondence of Queen Victoria and her daughters represents a potential bonfire of secrets on a continental scale. centered on a subject so sensitive it was dubbed the royal disease, hemophilia. This inherited bleeding disorder, passed down through Victoria's female line, became a quiet, terrifying specter haunting the nurseries and council chambers of Europe. A genetic flaw with the power to destabilize alliances and alter the course of history. The question that lingers in the archives is whether some of the most candid letters between the Queen and her daughters, particularly those discussing the health of their sons, were deliberately destroyed to contain the truth about this spreading scourge. To grasp the weight of this potential destruction, you must first understand the unique position of Queen Victoria as the matriarch of modern Europe. Through her 9 children's strategic marriages, she became the literal grandmother of Europe, with her descendants sitting on the thrones of Germany, Russia, Spain, and several other nations. This web of familial connections was her masterpiece of diplomatic influence. Yet, unbeknownst to her, she was also the source of a genetic mutation. Hemophilia, a condition where the blood fails to clot properly, is an X-linked recessive disorder, meaning it is typically passed from a carrier mother to her sons. Victoria herself was almost certainly the first carrier in her line, a spontaneous mutation that would have profound consequences. Her son, Prince Leopold, suffered from the disease, enduring painful bouts of bleeding and bruising that made his short life a misery and ultimately killed him from a minor fall at age 30. But more critically, at least 2 of her daughters, Alice and Beatrice, were carriers, passing the gene directly into the German and Russian imperial houses. Imagine the content of the letters that might have been deemed too dangerous to preserve. The Victorian court was a place of intense public propriety, and the monarchy's image was one of robust, divinely ordained health. A hereditary flaw like hemophilia struck at the heart of this image, suggesting weakness in the bloodline itself. The private correspondence between Victoria and her married daughters, especially Alice in Hesse and Beatrice in Battenberg, would have been a continuous, running medical bulletin. They would have exchanged agonizing details about their son's latest hemorrhages, the desperate searches for effective treatments, and the constant, gnawing fear that a simple cut or a minor bump could lead to a torturous, drawn-out death. These were not just personal tragedies, they were state secrets. For a daughter like Alice, writing to her mother about the health of her own hemophiliac son, Friedrich, known as Fritty, whose death at age 3 came after a fall from a window, the letters would have been raw with a grief that also carried a chilling political warning. If such candid discussions were systematically culled from the record, it points to a conscious effort to control the narrative, to prevent the full, terrifying scope of this dynastic vulnerability from becoming known, even within the family itself. The incentive for such destruction becomes starkly clear when you consider the geopolitical fallout. By the late 19th century, the intermarriage of Victoria's descendants had turned hemophilia into a diplomatic weapon and a source of immense instability. The most catastrophic example was the introduction of the disease into the Russian imperial family through Victoria's granddaughter, Alex of Hesse, who became Tsarina Alexandra. Her son, Alexei's, severe hemophilia directly contributed to the rise of Grigory Rasputin, as his apparent ability to stop the boy's bleeding episodes gave him unparalleled influence over the Tsarina, thereby alienating the aristocracy and fueling the revolution. If the British royal family had a clearer, earlier understanding of the inheritance pattern, which they seemed to grasp on some instinctive level, the revelation that they had knowingly allowed a defective princess to marry the heir to the Russian throne would have been a scandal of international proportions. It could have shattered the Anglo-Russian alliance. Burning the most explicit letters that discuss the familial pattern would have been a way to maintain plausible deniability, to protect the reputation of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and to avoid being blamed for potentially exporting a fatal flaw that was weakening other European monarchies. This leads us to the haunting silence in the historical record. While many letters between Victoria and her daughters survive, their sheer volume suggests a parallel archive of what is missing. We have glimpses of the concern. Victoria wrote of her dear bleeding boys and expressed anxiety about the marriages of her carrier daughters. But the truly systematic discussions, the ones that might have explicitly mapped the gene's path or expressed regret over specific marital alliances, are conspicuously absent. The curation of the royal archives was, and remains, a meticulous process. It is entirely plausible that later generations, perhaps during the reign of King George V, seeing the chaos hemophilia had wrought in Russia and the mounting political tensions in Europe, made the calculated decision to prune the family tree of paper. Removing the most damning evidence was a way to protect the institution of the monarchy itself from accusations of biological carelessness. It was an act of dynastic hygiene, ensuring that the story of the royal houses would be one of power and lineage, not one of a tragic, uncontrollable gene silently passed from mother to son, from one throne room to the next, leaving a trail of suffering and political disarray in its wake. The absence of these letters forces us to read between the lines of history, to see the shadow of the disease not in the words that remain, but in the profound and purposeful silence where other words used to be. Imagine a woman, not a monarch, but a queen in her own right, holding court not in a palace, but in a gaslit New York ballroom. She is our composite, a figure we might call Mrs. Rutherford, a name that evokes both old money and new ambition. Think of her as a sharper, more calculating version of the legendary Mrs. Astor, a social architect whose true power lay not in her guest list, but in a private, leather-bound ledger she kept locked in her desk. This was no simple diary of parties and gossip. It was a professional matchmaker's master ledger, a coldly analytical playbook detailing every transaction in the transatlantic marriage market. And according to the whispers that trickled down through time, as her influence waned and a new, less discreet era dawned, she took this explosive volume and committed it to the flames of her marble fireplace. What secrets did that burning ledger hold? It was far more than a list of names. For a matchmaker like Mrs. Rutherford, each potential heiress was assessed with the dispassionate eye of a commodities trader. Her ledger contained intricate profiles, not just the size of a Vanderbilt or a Whitney daughter's fortune, but its liquidity. Was it in solid railroad stock or volatile mining shares? Was it held in trust or readily available? Alongside the financials were brutal physical and psychological assessments. Notes on a girl's constitution: was she sturdy enough to bear the air required by a European dynasty? Observations on her temperament: was she pliable and ambitious, or headstrong and romantic? The latter could be a significant liability. On the other side of the equation were the aristocrats. The ledger cataloged them not by their titles alone, but by the depth of their debts. It noted the crumbling state of their ancestral homes, the mortgages on their land, and the exact sum required to restore a Norman castle or a Scottish estate to its former glory. Each potential union was a complex equation, balancing American millions against European prestige, with Mrs. Rutherford taking a discreet but substantial broker's fee from both parties, a fee that was, of course, meticulously recorded in the now vanished pages. The destruction of this playbook was a final, calculated act of reputation management, not just for Mrs. Rutherford, but for the entire social edifice she helped build. By the early 20th century, the glamorous facade of the dollar princess was beginning to crack. The public was growing wise to the transactional nature of these alliances, and the participants themselves, particularly the heiresses who had endured miserable marriages, were becoming less silent. The ledger's existence was a direct threat. Had it survived, it would have provided irrefutable, documented proof that the most celebrated society weddings of the Gilded Age were not fairy tales, but corporate mergers. It would have revealed the exact price paid for a duchess's coronet or a countess's tiara, reducing centuries of lineage to a line item in an account book. For the great families on both sides of the Atlantic, whose power relied on the mystique of tradition and the perception of effortless superiority, this was an intolerable prospect. The fire ensured that the cold, hard business behind the romance would remain a matter of speculation, allowing the myth of the glorious transatlantic match to persist in the public imagination. This single act of destruction fundamentally warps our understanding of this peculiar social phenomenon. Without the matchmaker's records, we are forced to rely on the public narratives, the glowing newspaper accounts of the weddings, the official portraits, and the often sanitized memoirs written decades later. We lose the gritty truth of the negotiations, the panic of a duke whose creditors were at the door, the desperation of a nouveau-rich father to scrub his fortune clean with a title, and the quiet anguish of a young woman like our composite Consuelo Vanderbilt, whose personal preferences were systematically overridden by a system documented in ledgers just like Mrs. Rutherford's. The burned playbook obscures the human cost, turning complex stories of coercion, ambition, and survival into simple, glamorous headlines. Its ashes represent the lost testimony of an entire era's social machinery, a deliberate erasure that allows us to remember the Gilded Age for its glittering balls and magnificent jewels, while the ledger's fire ensures we forget the exact, calculated price paid for every last bit of that glitter. Yet for all the deliberate fires lit in marble fireplaces and palace hearths, some of history's most profound silences were created by a very different element: the chilling, unforgiving water of the North Atlantic. The story of the RMS Lusitania's sinking on May 7, 1915, is rightly remembered as a horrific maritime tragedy and a pivotal act of modern warfare that helped draw the United States into the First World War. But beneath the overarching narrative of the 1,198 lives lost lies a more subtle historical catastrophe: the destruction of a floating archive of sensitive correspondence. The Lusitania was not merely a passenger liner. She was a courier, carrying a cargo of letters from some of the most prominent Gilded Age figures and European aristocrats of the era. Their personal and political secrets, entrusted to the post, were lost to the deep, creating a void in our understanding of the intricate tensions crisscrossing the Atlantic in the spring of 1915. The water that flooded the ship's mailroom achieved with brutal efficiency what so many had tried to do with flame. It granted certain secrets a permanent and absolute burial. To understand the value of what was lost, you must picture the passenger manifest not just as a list of names, but as a web of powerful connections. On board were figures like the fabulously wealthy sporting goods magnate Albert L. Hopkins, the multi-millionaire businessman Charles Frohman, and the renowned art collector Sir Hugh Lane. These men moved in the highest circles of finance and society, and their correspondence would have been a treasure trove of commercial intelligence and personal ambition. They were the transatlantic elite, the people who funded political campaigns, brokered international deals, and whose private opinions could sway public sentiment. More critically, the Lusitania was carrying a tremendous volume of regular mail, thousands upon thousands of letters in sealed bags in her hold. This was the primary communication network of the age, and within those sacks were letters between diplomats, intelligence agents, industrialists, and expatriates. They contained unvarnished assessments of the war's progress, candid opinions on American neutrality, and the raw data of personal experience that never made it into official reports or sanitized newspaper accounts. The sinking, therefore, was not just an attack on a ship. It was an attack on the very nervous system of the Western world, severing lines of communication and drowning a unique, real-time snapshot of a world at war. The loss of this specific correspondence had immediate and tangible consequences for intelligence operations. In the years leading up to the war, and in its early months, the British had mastered the art of maritime interception. The Room 40 code-breaking unit relied heavily on seizing diplomatic bags from neutral vessels to gather intelligence on German plans and global opinion. The Lusitania's mail, had it arrived, would have been a bonanza for British intelligence, offering a window into American thinking and potentially revealing German espionage activities operating from within the United States. Conversely, its destruction at the hands of a German U-boat meant that an entire stream of potential intelligence simply evaporated. This event, more than any other, forced a dramatic rethink in how sensitive information was moved across the ocean. It became starkly clear that trusting critical dispatches to a civilian liner, even the fastest and most celebrated one afloat, was an unacceptable risk. The sinking accelerated the shift toward more secure, dedicated diplomatic channels and the use of complex encryption for all but the most mundane communications. The water of the Irish Sea, in effect, wrote the final chapter in the age of casual transatlantic correspondence, ushering in a new era of state-controlled secrecy and cryptographic complexity. Beyond the immediate intelligence shockwave, the sinking created a permanent historical blind spot. The letters lost with the Lusitania would have provided an unparalleled, ground-level view of the social and political climate of 1915. We have official histories and government documents, but the true texture of an era is often found in the personal missives. The letter from a banker in New York to his partner in London, fretting about war loans and market instability. The note from a society hostess in Paris to a friend in Philadelphia, describing the grim mood and the changing faces at her salons. The heartfelt words, a British soldier at the front, writing home to his family in America, describing the reality of trench warfare in a way that censorship would never allow for publication. This collective voice, this chorus of individual experiences and private thoughts, was silenced forever. Their absence means that our understanding of that specific moment in time is inherently incomplete, pieced together from the documents that survived on land, which are by their nature more formal, more guarded, and less human. Perhaps the most poignant loss revolves around the prominent individuals who went down with the ship. Take the case of Sir Hugh Lane, a leading art collector who was in the midst of a bitter and very public dispute over his will and his magnificent collection of Impressionist paintings. He was carrying personal papers relating to this feud, documents that could have clarified his final intentions and potentially resolved a legal battle that would rage for decades after his death. The cold Atlantic water did not just claim his life. It made his last wishes irretrievably ambiguous, ensuring his legacy would be fought over in courts for generations. Similarly, the personal correspondence of figures like Charles Frohman would have shed light on the state of transatlantic entertainment and the immense challenges faced by industries navigating a world fractured by war. The sinking of the Lusitania, therefore, stands as a unique and tragic monument to destruction by chance. Unlike the controlled, purposeful fires we have explored, this was an erasure born from the chaos of conflict. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by the secrets people choose to burn, but also by the countless unspoken truths that are lost to the indifferent and relentless passage of time, sinking into the deep and taking their stories with them. If the flames of Yekaterinburg consumed the last private words of the Romanovs, then the conflagration that swept across Russia during and after the Bolshevik Revolution was a firestorm of a different order entirely. This was not the targeted destruction of a single family's secrets, but a systematic, ideological incineration of an entire world. As the old order crumbled, the very paper it was built upon, the sprawling archives of the aristocracy, the meticulously kept diaries of the nobility, and the vast correspondence of the imperial bureaucracy, was deemed not just obsolete, but dangerous. In townhouses and country estates, in chancelleries and private libraries, a conscious campaign of erasure began, a bonfire of the vanities on a scale that history had rarely seen, creating a void in our understanding of Imperial Russia that is both profound and permanent. To grasp the magnitude of this loss, you have to picture the world that was being erased. For centuries, the Russian aristocracy had been prodigious record keepers. Their libraries were not merely collections of books, but repositories of lived experience. They contained bound volumes of personal letters spanning generations, detailed household account books that painted a vivid picture of daily life, and thousands of pages of diaries filled with candid reflections on everything from court politics to family drama. These were the archives of the Sheremetevs, the Yusupovs, the Golitsyn's families whose names were synonymous with the empire itself. Within these private collections lay the unfiltered, human counter narrative to the official state histories. They held the key to understanding the complex social fabric of a society that was suddenly and violently being torn apart. For the Bolsheviks, these documents represented more than just paper. They were the physical residue of the former people, the Bolshoi Ljudi, and their existence was an affront to the new revolutionary reality being forged. To build a new world, the evidence of the old one had to be destroyed. The process of destruction was often chaotic and brutally pragmatic. As the Red Army advanced and peasant uprisings swept the countryside, the great estates of the nobility were prime targets. While looting for valuables was common, the destruction of papers was frequently a deliberate act. For the revolutionaries, these archives symbolized the very system of oppression. They were overthrowing the deeds to lands that had been taken, the records of serf ownership, the correspondence that detailed the intricate web of privilege and power. Burning them was a symbolic act of liberation, a way to annihilate the legal and historical claims of the old elite. In more than one case, documents were used for the most mundane of purposes, as fuel for stoves, as rolling paper for cigarettes, or as stuffing for broken windows in the harsh Russian winter. The sheer, desperate utility of paper in a time of chaos and deprivation meant that a diary kept by a princess for 50 years might be used to start a cooking fire, its delicate script vanishing in an instant to heat a pot of soup. Yet, the most significant erasure was likely orchestrated at a higher level. As the Bolsheviks consolidated power, they established organizations like the Cheka, their secret police, whose mission included controlling information. There is compelling evidence that a systematic effort was made to purge state archives and confiscated private collections of material deemed ideologically harmful or that could be used by enemies of the revolution. This wasn't random vandalism. It was a calculated program of historical editing. Imagine the scene in a Cheka cellars or a commandeered palace ballroom. Officials sifting through mountains of seized papers, deciding what to preserve for potential intelligence value and what to condemn to the furnace. Letters that revealed the inner workings of the Tsarist secret police might be kept, while intimate family correspondence that humanized the aristocracy was fed to the flames. The goal was to create a curated historical record, one that presented the old regime as a monolithic, corrupt, and inhuman entity, thereby justifying the revolution's violence and solidifying the new regime's legitimacy. The consequence of this great burning is a historical landscape scarred by absences. We can read the official proclamations of Tsars and the dry reports of ministers, but we have lost the voices that would have given those events texture, nuance, and contradiction. The destruction of these personal archives means we lack the granular detail of how power was actually wielded in the provinces, how marriages were negotiated between great families, and how the cultural and intellectual life of the aristocracy truly functioned. It has forced historians to rely heavily on the memoirs of those who escaped writings that are invaluable, but are also filtered through the lens of exile, trauma, and a natural desire to justify one's own past. The Bolshevik fires created a historical black hole, a silence where a chorus of voices used to be. We are left to reconstruct the lost world of Imperial Russia from its charred edges, forever wondering about the millions of unwritten stories, the unrecorded conversations, and the intimate truths that turn to smoke and ash, leaving behind a past that is, in many ways, as much a phantom as the empire that once was. And yet, even as we chronicle the lost worlds of Russia and the sunken secrets of the Lusitania, we must recognize that the instinct to erase has not faded with the passing of the quill pen. It has simply evolved finding a new, infinitely more efficient medium in the digital realm. Today, the crackling fire in the hearth has been replaced by the silent, instantaneous tap of a delete button. The burning of a single physical letter required a moment of deliberate, solitary action. Now, an entire archive of potential evidence, emails, text messages, and direct messages, can be vanished into the ether with a few clicks, leaving behind no smoke, no ash, and often, no legal recourse. This modern form of burning is perhaps even more absolute than its historical counterpart, and it continues to shape scandals and rewrite historical narratives in real time, playing out on a global stage before our very eyes. Think of the direct message, or DM, as the modern heir to the clandestine royal dispatch or the Gilded Age heiress's secret note. It is intimate, immediate, and feels ephemeral. A digital whisper exchanged in what feels like a private room. Yet, much like a physical letter, it creates a tangible record, a string of code that can be screenshot, forwarded, and weaponized in an instant. For today's elites, celebrities, politicians, tech billionaires, and influencers, this creates a perpetual state of vulnerability. A heated exchange with a rival, a confidential business plan shared too casually, or a compromising photo sent in a moment of trust can all become the casket letters of the 21st century. The response when scandal looms is often a digital bonfire. We've seen it time and again, the frantic deletion of entire email servers, the mass purge of social media histories, and the infamous disappearing message feature that promises the same finality as a flame. This isn't just about hiding a secret. It's about controlling a narrative with a speed and scale that Empress Maria Theresa could never have imagined. The decision to burn these digital documents is a preemptive strike, an attempt to erase a potential future before it can ever become a tangible past. The consequences of this digital destruction are playing out in our courtrooms, in our news cycles, with stunning regularity. Consider the myriad of high-profile legal battles where the central question revolves around deleted evidence. In corporate lawsuits, the deliberate destruction of emails, known legally as spoliation, can lead to massive fines and jury instructions that assume the lost information was damning. In celebrity defamation cases, the recovery of a single, unsent text message from a cloud server can overturn an entire case. Unlike a burned letter, which is gone forever, digital data often leaves a ghost, a metadata footprint that proves a file existed and was deliberately destroyed. This creates a paradoxical situation. The act of digital burning can itself become the most incriminating evidence, a modern-day equivalent of finding soot on someone's hands next to a cold fireplace. The narrative is no longer just about the content of the lost message, but about the conscious effort to hide it, a story of guilt written not in ink, but in the deliberate act of erasure. This shift has fundamentally altered the very nature of historical record-keeping. In the past, historians pieced together narratives from the letters that survived, reading between the lines of what was preserved. Tomorrow's historians will face a far more daunting task, sifting through the void left by systematic digital deletion. The official record of our time may well be a collection of press releases and public social media posts, the curated, sanitized facade. The truly candid conversations, the raw, unfiltered debates that reveal how decisions were actually made are increasingly happening in encrypted, ephemeral channels that leave no trace. We are creating a historical landscape dominated by the official story, with the dissenting voices and behind-the-scenes truths deliberately and efficiently scrubbed from existence. The burned letters of the digital age are creating a silence more profound than any before, because the tools for creating that silence are in everyone's pockets, and the decision to use them can be made in a heartbeat, forever altering our understanding of the power dynamics shaping our world today. Yet for all the deliberate acts of destruction, a remarkable truth endures. Not every secret is destined to remain forever lost. In a fascinating twist of historical irony, the very fires meant to erase evidence have, in some incredible cases, inadvertently preserved it, creating a kind of time capsule that modern science is only now learning to open. This field, known as forensic paleography, or simply forensic history, is dedicated to the seemingly impossible task of reading the ashes themselves, resurrecting words from documents that were carbonized centuries or even millennia ago. It is a discipline that marries the patience of an archivist with the precision of a laboratory scientist, and its breakthroughs offer a powerful counter-narrative to the tales of permanent loss we have explored, proving that some voices silenced by flame are merely waiting for the right moment to speak again. Perhaps the most stunning example of this phenomenon comes not from a Gilded Age mansion or a royal palace, but from the Roman seaside town of Herculaneum. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79, it did not just bury the town in ash. It unleashed a pyroclastic surge of superheated gas and volcanic matter that carbonized an entire library of papyrus scrolls in a single catastrophic instant. For centuries, these charred lumps were considered utterly unreadable, as fragile as charcoal and impossible to unroll without causing them to crumble into dust. They were the ultimate burned letters, their contents sealed by volcanic fire. But recently, a multidisciplinary team of researchers began applying 21st century technology to this 2,000-year-old problem. Using sophisticated X-ray phase contrast tomography, a technique similar to a medical CT scan, but infinitely more sensitive, they have been able to peer inside the scrolls without physically touching them. The technology can detect the subtle differences in density between the carbon-based ink and the carbon-based papyrus, effectively mapping the ghost of the text hidden within the scorched layers. What was once an unopenable, blackened log is now virtually an unrolled page. Scholars are painstakingly decoding the results, and while the full library's contents are not yet known, they are almost certain to include lost works of Greek and Roman philosophy, poetry, and science, a literary treasure trove that was, paradoxically, saved from total decay by the very inferno that appeared to destroy it. This same principle of reading what the fire has left behind is being applied to much more recent conflagrations. In forensic laboratories around the world, techniques have been developed to recover text from documents damaged in house fires, arson cases, and even terror attacks. The key lies in the chemical transformation that occurs when paper burns. Complete combustion turns paper to white ash, which holds no information, but partial combustion, or charring, creates a fragile, blackened carbon structure that retains the physical imprint of the ink, even if the ink itself has burned away. The challenge is that this charred document is often too delicate to handle, and the contrast too faint for the naked eye to perceive. Scientists overcome this by using advanced imaging. A multispectral imaging, for instance, involves photographing the document under different wavelengths of light, from ultraviolet to infrared. Certain types of residue from iron gall ink, the most common ink for centuries, absorb infrared light differently than the charred paper around them, making the script suddenly leap into view on a screen. In other cases, gentle chemical treatments can be applied to stabilize the brittle paper, allowing conservators to carefully separate the pages and use high-resolution digital scanners to capture every minute detail, which can then be enhanced with software to improve legibility. The implications of this technological resurrection are profound for our understanding of history. Every time a technique like this is successfully applied, it's as if a tiny pinprick of light appears in the vast darkness of our lost archives. A charred letter recovered from the ruins of a bombed-out World War II building might reveal the last words of a resistance fighter. A partially burned ledger pulled from a sunken shipwreck could clarify a disputed business transaction that shaped an industry. These aren't just academic exercises. They are acts of restoring stolen narratives. They give us back individual voices and specific details that help us correct the historical record, challenging the official stories that were often written by the victors or the powerful, who had the means to control which documents survived. This scientific detective work ensures that the truth, however damaged, has a fighting chance against the obfuscation of time and the violence of those who sought to silence it. This ongoing work serves as a powerful and hopeful coda to our journey through the ashes. It reminds us that the human drive to uncover the past is as resilient as the drive to conceal it. For every secret deliberately cast into a fireplace, there is now a team of dedicated individuals working to decipher its echo. They are the inheritors of a new kind of detective story, one where the clues are not fingerprints on a weapon, but the microscopic variations in carbon density on a piece of paper that has survived the worst that history could throw at it. While we will never recover every burned letter, the fact that we can recover any at all is nothing short of a miracle. It means that the final word on history is never truly written until the last ember has been examined, and the last ghost of ink has been coaxed back from the void, offering us a second chance to listen to the whispers the flames tried and failed to extinguish. This journey through the ashes has been driven by a fundamental, almost insatiable curiosity, a belief that knowing the full truth is an inherent good. But this pursuit forces us to confront a deeply unsettling ethical question. Are there some truths that are better left in the ashes? Does the world's right to know a historical fact always outweigh an individual's right to privacy, even long after they are gone? The historian's instinct is to preserve, to uncover, to complete the record. Yet, we must pause and consider if that instinct can, at times, become a form of intellectual trespass, a violation of a sacred trust that was placed in the fire for a reason. Not every secret is a state secret. Some are simply painfully human, and their exposure might bring more harm than enlightenment. Think of the most vulnerable moments of your own life, the raw, unfiltered grief poured into a journal after a loss, the desperate, private confession of a failing marriage, or the intimate details of a physical or mental health struggle. Now imagine a stranger unearthing those words a century from now and publishing them for global consumption, dissecting your pain for academic debate or public entertainment. This is the reality we must grapple with when we wish for the burned letters of the past to be restored. For every politically explosive document that could reshape our understanding of a treaty or a war, there might be a dozen more that contain nothing more than the private anguish of a human being who never saw it and does not deserve our posthumous scrutiny. The burning of such letters could be seen not as an act of concealment, but as an act of profound self-protection, a final effort to safeguard a personal dignity that official histories so often ignore. This ethical quandary becomes even more acute when we consider the impact on living descendants. The sins, the scandals, and the traumas of the past do not vanish with the individuals who experience them. They echo through generations. A letter burned by a Gilded Age heiress to hide an affair or an illegitimate child might have been an attempt to protect her children from social ostracism. If modern technology were to magically recover that letter today, it could shatter the family narratives of her living great-grandchildren, causing real and lasting emotional distress. The revelation of a hidden genetic condition, like hemophilia, in a royal family's burned correspondence could have implications for modern relatives who never knew they carried a genetic marker for a serious illness. The historian's quest for a complete picture must be weighed against the potential to reopen old wounds for people who had no part in creating them, forcing them to confront a legacy they did not choose and may not wish to be defined by. There is also a compelling argument that some mysteries are essential to the human experience of history itself. The burned letters of Empress Elisabeth of Austria, for instance, are central to her enigmatic allure. Her systematic destruction of her own writings was a deliberate act of self-creation, a final assertion of control over how she would be remembered. By respecting that fire, by allowing that void to remain, we are in a sense honoring her last wish. To recover every scorched page would be to strip her of the autonomy she fought so desperately to maintain in life. The unknown is a powerful component of legend and memory. It allows for interpretation, for poetry, for a connection that is not dictated solely by cold, hard facts. The absence of evidence forces us to engage with the complexity of a character, to grapple with ambiguity, and in doing so, we often arrive at a richer, more nuanced understanding than a straightforward recitation of their private thoughts might ever provide. This is not to argue for ignorance, but for a more thoughtful, empathetic approach to the past, one that recognizes that the people we study were not merely historical actors, but complex individuals with a right to their private sorrows and secrets. The drive to know everything must be tempered by the wisdom to discern when knowing might cross a line from education into exploitation. The flames that consumed so many of history's letters have left us with an imperfect, fragmented record. But perhaps that imperfection is not a flaw to be corrected at all costs. It may be a necessary feature, a built-in respect for the boundaries between public legacy and private life, a quiet acknowledgement that some chapters are meant to remain closed, their stories entrusted forever to the silent, final confidentiality of the ash. It is a staggering thought that the world we inhabit, a world shaped by global wars, shifting borders, and the very dynasties that rule us, may rest upon a foundation of delicate, irreplaceable paper, and that the decision to light a single match could alter its course forever. This is not merely a poetic notion. It is the terrifying reality of the butterfly effect as applied to history. We have wandered through the smoldering ashes of palaces and parlors, but now we must confront the profound, almost frightening implication of it all. That the deliberate destruction of one seemingly insignificant letter did not just erase a secret, but actively forged the chain of events that led to our present moment. The burning of a document is not a passive act of concealment. It is an aggressive intervention in the timeline, a conscious choice to steer history down one path by obliterating all others. Consider for a moment a single fictional letter, a dispatch written in the spring of 1914 by a minor Austrian diplomat stationed in Belgrade. He has pieced together whispers of a radical plot, a plan by a young nationalist to assassinate the Archduke Franz Ferdinand during his upcoming visit. The diplomat writes a coded, urgent warning to his superiors in Vienna, laying out the specific details, the date, the location, the names of the conspirators. This letter, this thin sheaf of paper, contains the potential to avert a global catastrophe. But imagine the diplomat, a man with his own ambitions and fears, also includes in his report some damning personal speculation about the complicity of certain Serbian officials' accusations he cannot prove. Fearing his own career will be ruined by these unsubstantiated claims if the plot fails, he hesitates. In a moment of panic, he holds the letter over a candle flame. The edges curl, the ink vanishes, and the warning turns to a small pile of black ash on his desk. Weeks later, in Sarajevo, a bullet finds its mark, and the First World War begins. That single act of personal preservation, the burning of one unsent letter, just cost the lives of millions and redrew the map of the 20th century. This is the ripple effect in its most dramatic form, but the principle operates just as powerfully in the intimate sphere of love and lineage. Revisit the heart-wrenching story of George IV and Maria Fitzherbert. The fire that consumed their marriage certificate did more than just break two hearts. It directly manipulated the British line of succession for a century. Had that document survived and their marriage been acknowledged, George would have been legally barred from the throne for marrying a Catholic. His brother would have become king sooner, potentially altering the entire political landscape of the Regency era. More consequentially, George would never have been forced into his disastrous, hateful union with Caroline of Brunswick. Without that toxic marriage, there would have been no Princess Charlotte. And without Princess Charlotte's tragic death in childbirth, the crown would not have passed to her uncle, William IV, and then to his niece, Victoria. The entire Victorian age, that defining epoch of British identity, industry, and empire, might never have happened. The world would lack the cultural touchstones of Victorian morality, its literature, and its global influence. All because a piece of paper, proving a king's true love, was turned to smoke to preserve a Protestant succession that, in the end, led to a queen who defined an era. The pattern repeats itself in the cold calculus of Gilded Age transactions. When Alva Vanderbilt forced her daughter Consuelo to burn Winthrop Rutherford's love letters, she was not just extinguishing a young woman's happiness. She was activating a transatlantic chain reaction. That act cleared the way for the Vanderbilt millions to flow into Blenheim Palace, shoring up the Marlborough dynasty and cementing a powerful social and financial alliance between American new money and British aristocracy. This union influenced diplomatic ties, shaped cultural exchange, and demonstrated the raw purchasing power of wealth in a way that encouraged a whole generation of American heiresses to seek titled husbands. Had those letters survived, had Consuelo mustered the courage to defy her mother and elope, the social landscape of two continents would have shifted. The Marlboroughs might have lost their ancestral home. The Vanderbilt fortune might have been directed into different American ventures, and the very template of the Dollar Princess might have been less gloriously successful. One bundle of letters in a New York fireplace didn't just change one life. It helped forge a transatlantic elite. This phenomenon forces us to reconsider the very nature of historical causality. We are taught that history is driven by great forces: economics, social movements, technological advancement. And while that is true, our journey through the ashes reveals that it is also intensely vulnerable to the smallest, most personal of interventions. A queen's private heartbreak, a businessman's hidden greed, a mother's ruthless ambition, these are not footnotes. When committed to paper and then deliberately destroyed, these human frailties become invisible pivots upon which history turns. The burned letter creates a silence so powerful, it becomes an actor in the narrative, a negative space that dictates the shape of everything around it. We are left living in the world shaped by these absences, navigating a reality constructed from a million such tiny, deliberate acts of erasure, each one a silent architect of the world we know today. And so we reach the final, quiet embers of our journey, a path that has taken us from the gilded cages of heiresses to the prison rooms of Tsars, from the private studies of kings to the courtrooms of a modern century. We have witnessed again and again the same desperate, calculated gesture, a hand holding a piece of paper over a flame. But what does this relentless act of destruction truly tell us? It reveals that history is not a solid, unchangeable edifice, but a fragile narrative constantly being written, edited, and in some cases, burned by the very people who lived it. These fiery silences are not mere footnotes. They are active, powerful forces that have shaped our world. They have decided the fate of empires, redirected the flow of vast fortunes, and sealed the tragic destinies of individuals whose only crime was possessing a truth too dangerous to exist. Our understanding of love, power, and scandal is irrevocably filtered through the smoke of these fires, leaving us with a version of the past that is often more sanitized, more palatable, and far less human than the reality. The burned letter forces us to confront a haunting paradox, that the most truthful history might be the one we can never read. The official record gives us dates and decrees, but it is in the unguarded, private confession, the words written for a single pair of eyes, that we find the real motivation, the raw fear, the passionate love, or the cynical calculation that actually drove events. When those words are lost, we lose the key to understanding the human heart at the center of the historical storm. We are left with the grand facade, the public performance, while the backstage drama, where the real decisions were made, remains shrouded in mystery. This absence creates a permanent ambiguity, a space where legend and speculation flourish. Was a queen a villain or a victim? Was a king's abdication an act of romance or a cover for treason? The answers likely turn to ash, leaving us with questions that will echo through the ages, ensuring that these figures remain eternally fascinating and ultimately unknowable. This collective act of destruction across centuries and continents speaks to a universal human experience, the powerful desire to control our own story. From a Tsarina burning letters to protect her family's fragile reputation, to a Gilded Age matron incinerating her daughter's dreams to secure a dynasty, the motivation is strikingly similar. It is the attempt to curate a legacy, to project an image of strength, propriety, or stability, and to hide the messy, complicated, and often painful reality of human frailty. Fire offers the illusion of a clean slate, a way to command the narrative by removing its most inconvenient chapters. But as we have seen, this never fully works. The void left behind becomes a story in itself, a glaring absence that hints at the magnitude of the secret. The scorch mark on the hearth is, in its own way, as telling as the letter that once lay upon it. As we close this chapter, we are left with a profound appreciation for the fragments that survived and a sense of mourning for the voices forever silenced. The ghosts of these burned letters remind us that history is a palimpsest, a document written over many times, with the faint traces of erased stories still visible beneath the surface, if we know how to look. They teach us that power is not just about what is proclaimed from a throne, but also about what is hidden in a fireplace. And they challenge us to listen more carefully to the silences in the historical record, for it is often in those quiet spaces that the most dramatic secrets reside. Now we turn the story over to you. History is not just made in palaces. It unfolds in every family, in every home. Do you have a story passed down through your own family about a lost letter, a destroyed diary, or a mystery that vanished with a generation? Perhaps there's a local historical figure in your town rumored to have buried a secret or a century-old scandal that everyone whispers about, but no one can prove. Share those stories in the comments below. Let's continue this detective work together, because sometimes the most fascinating histories are the ones waiting to be rediscovered, not in a grand archive, but in the shared memory of all of us.